I'm Dr. Jill Leibold. I'm one of the directors of jury research with Litigation Insights. We've been so happy to interact with all of you over the past 4 weeks of webinars, and we really appreciate all your involvement. I'd like to introduce our other two speakers here today, Dr. Nick Pollevin and Dr. Katrina Cook. Dr. Pollevin has 7 years of experience in jury psychology in the legal field. He uses his knowledge and experience both in court during jury selection and in developing themes and recommendations for trial from that jury research. Also with us is Dr. Cook. She has 11 years of practical application, study, and research in communication, jury research, and cognitive psychology. She's conducted surveys and mock trials and has assisted counsel in implementing themes discovered during this research into their case arguments. Because we have a variety of people on the line, I wanted to give a brief introduction. Litigation Insights is a full-service national litigation consulting firm with 3 discipline areas: jury research, our graphics and animation specialist, and trial technology. Our jury research group offers focus group mock trials, including online during these times, and large-scale community attitude surveys, along with jury selection and internet research of potential jurors. We also offer assistance with graphics and demonstrative development, video deposition editing, and in-court and virtual technology support. I do want to offer a very special thank you to our visual communications and graphics team for their help with this webinar and our presentation. We had volumes of data, and their efforts to summarize it into a compact visual story really paid off by helping us communicate our findings more clearly for you all. So a big thank you to our graphics team today. So Litigation Insights saw this COVID-19 stay-at-home and virus crisis as a watershed moment that could affect the ways jurors interact with each other and how they feel psychologically and emotionally and how they perceive our clients in court. We grasped this opportunity and conducted a series of national surveys of jury eligibles during March and April of this year to assess respondents' attitudes and experiences on social media, corporations, the federal government and government agencies, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and respiratory protection. What will we face when we get back to our mock trials and jury selections? What's changed? What hasn't? Well, we plan to offer several future blogs with the full results of these surveys. We're presenting a first look of select findings to you all on this early access webinar. It was really exciting for our team as a supplement to the surveys to grasp this opportunity to research several hundred of our former jurors' social media from recent trials that had implemented jury questionnaires and for whom we had past social networking searches. We examined the posts to see how social media searches of trial jurors may change the way we evaluate our jurors during and maybe even after this time. In one of our surveys, we asked jury eligibles about their concerns about the coronavirus for their own health and that of their close family and friends. As you can see, 28% were very concerned about contracting COVID-19 themselves, but 36% were very concerned about their family or close friends, even more so. Interestingly, respondents reported being more worried about their friends and families contracting the virus than themselves. So how does this concern affect jurors' anxiety and social media? That's what we set out to examine. So we re-reviewed 335 and counting former trial jurors' social media posts to see what they updated regarding COVID-19. We coded their posts into 21 topics so we could ascertain whether people were pouring their hearts out, jabbing fun, or using this as a political stand. The results were interesting. The top genre was jokes and memes about COVID, people trying to lighten up. Second were more serious posts about indirect effects such as employment, meat shortages, toilet paper hoarding, and the like. Taking precautions came in third. So this was a real former juror in a small town. She's in her mid-60s and was extremely quiet and stoic. Post-trial interviews suggested that she was not a leader in deliberations and had not been vocal in the group. Her deliberation behavior aligned with her courtroom behavior in voir dire. Her prior Facebook posts were rare, and they tended to be more of a weekly meme about religion or going to church. But post-COVID, she created a flurry of social media postings and activity across half of our categories. She posted several times a week about the number of cases and deaths in her county and the state. She posted a mix of religious memes, concerned statistics about the virus's spread in the area, and some memes about people behaving foolishly and to stop hoarding. However, given the sheer new volume of posts across so many categories, we may have had a little more concern about her willingness or ability to step into a more vocal role in deliberations. And her worry about the virus's spread and the behavior specific to her local community would have triggered a deeper look. Would she be so biased in favor of a hometown plaintiff that she would not be able to hear a corporate defendant's story? Is the sheer number of posts a sign of fear or anxiety? These would be additional flags to pursue when considering targeted voir dire and strikes. We wanted to look first at a couple of known pro-plaintiff risk factors. The prior juror you saw is a great example of what we may look for, emotional or concerned posts. So we rated the overall fearfulness and anxiety perceived in their posts on a scale from 1 to 3, with 1 being no fearfulness and 3 showing a great deal of fearfulness. Our analysis corresponded to what we know about fearfulness and state anxiety in identifying potential jurors who may be receptive to fear-based messaging, such as the reptile approach. Of jurors with visible social media posts, 50% of jurors were rated as not at all fearful. 35% were rated as somewhat fearful, and 15% were very fearful. The number of posts in March and April ranged from just 1 post to up to 188 posts. The average number of COVID posts was just under 20. Each month, the number of jurors posts increased, but for March and for April posts, the number of posts, regardless of topic, were significantly correlated to fearfulness. So Nick spoke last week about how anxiety affects jurors' receptiveness to the reptile approach. And since we're seeing some interesting fear-based effects during COVID, Nick, could you briefly revisit the concept from your webinar last week?
Sure. So one's trait anxiety is their general level of anxiety or worry. And it's measured with items such as I tend to worry about things more than my friends, or I often feel anxious. And what we have found is that plaintiff jurors do not report that they have higher trait anxiety than defense jurors. But state anxiety is one's worry about a specific threat. And that's what's of interest here, because we are looking at the level of anxiety or worry that people have towards COVID-19, which is the specific threat here. And our prior research has shown that susceptibility to state anxiety is a strong predictor of plaintiff jurors and reptile tactics in particular. So as we looked at jurors' social media posts and the level of concern they have, what we're looking at is their susceptibility to state anxiety about COVID-19.
So the reptile approach really appears to be pretty important with our latest analysis. Next, we also analyzed our past juror grades with the number of each of their social media posts. First, we looked at our initial grades of A through F assigned to jurors. We found our initial juror grades did not correlate to the number of jurors' COVID posts. Similarly, we looked at whether those same grades were related to jurors' fearfulness and anxiety ratings. Once again, those ratings did not correlate to the original juror grades. So while statistically the type or number of COVID posts couldn't distinguish jurors via their grades, we believe the content of posts is still very important. Does the juror feel in control of their life and destiny and health? Are they out in public groups protesting for their perceived social or constitutional freedoms? Are they hiding and afraid in their homes? These factors will be a new area to be evaluated juror by juror when we get back to jury trials. This information is telling us not that our past grades were wrong, but that we need to evaluate a new factor, assessing posts during the COVID-19 times when we evaluate risk to our cases. What we're seeing is that state anxiety is elevated, making reptile tactics perhaps more effective for those anxious and frequent posters. Additionally, it has caused some very quiet jurors to become vocal online. Only 15% were rated as high anxiety, so the volume identifies reptile-susceptible jurors going forward, at least in the near future, who may not have been on radar in the same way before. Are those formerly silent types becoming community advocates or thought leaders? So we surveyed jurors further about their social media, so stay on the lookout for future blogs with even more results. Next, we assessed respondents' views on a wide variety of corporations in the news during March and April to understand what jurors have heard in the media about positive or negative actions taken by individual corporations. And we also assessed their overall views of companies. How will corporate defendants be perceived in court now? And are those juror views different than they were before 2020? Where does this lead us in the near future due to the COVID situation? We start with a video of a juror in a recent mock trial who had an agenda, one against corporations and for what he calls justice. This juror is a reflection of a small minority of jurors who relay such messages on their trial questionnaires and in voir dire. So this type of response can set some alarm bells off in jury selection.
I came in here with pictures of stop signs. I came in here with pictures of rampant corporate neglect, of the hundreds of billions of dollars that is made, of the millions of people they've killed. We have a duty here as a jury. We are holding corporation. This is one of the things. This is one of the things that they're responsible for. Okay, but our duty as a citizen, my duty as a juror, is to bring justice. Justice for all wrongdoing by this corporation since its inception over 100 years ago. That's where I am today.
Yeah, but
that's where I'll be at the end of deliberation.
So one thing we've been asked by some of our corporate clients is whether they're going to get a little credit for their helpfulness toward the COVID-19 response, either in donations, vaccine research, or changing manufacturing to help make respirator materials and other protection. About 65% of jurors agreed that just because a corporation did a good deed, it doesn't mean they're free from a large damages award for its perceived bad behavior. But some of our other data will offer a more nuanced understanding of this view. To this point, one juror during voir dire in a recent case had this response when questioned about her views toward corporations on her trial questionnaire. And she responded, "I think we can all agree. There are some good companies and there's some bad companies. There's some good companies who might do some bad things and some bad companies that might do some good things." This answer suggests at least some jurors will take each corporation's actions into consideration individually. So we've collected over time about jurors' general views of corporations. Prior to 2020, a healthy 43% of jurors held positive attitudes generally about corporations, with only 15% being very positive. But on the other end of the spectrum, only 10% of jurors held very negative views. As you can see from the chart on the right, jurors' views in 2020 have spread out even further. While overall, jurors' positivity towards corporations fell by 2 points, those who felt very positively increased by 3%. While not a meaningful difference, it does suggest that corporations haven't lost their more loyal jury contingent during the time of COVID. However, the number of negative views increased 6 percentage points. Jurors are keeping an eye on corporations, and their views will likely stay in flux as they continue to feel the financial effects of COVID. In addition to looking at our past data on corporate attitudes, we also asked jurors if their opinions have changed for the positive or negative since the start of the COVID-19 outbreak. More jurors, nearly 30%, reported having somewhat to much better opinions of corporations, while just short of 25% held somewhat worse or much worse opinions. But most jurors had not changed their attitudes about corporations in general. We also asked about what they've heard in the media about specific companies. Only 15% of respondents had heard zero positive news about the companies on this list. Not surprisingly, hearing positive news about these companies increased people's positivity toward the companies. The top 5 companies gaining from recent media coverage were Google, Amazon, GM, Ford, and 3M. 36% of respondents had not heard any negative news about the companies on our list. Those who heard negative media on a company tended to shift their opinions more negatively. The top 5 companies that have generated more negativity were Amazon, Walmart, Facebook, Tesla, and Disney. You'll note that Amazon was in the top 5 in both lists. The good news is that for people who saw both ends of the spectrum of the media coverage, the positive seems to win out. Given the high unemployment rate the nation is currently experiencing and the hardships families are facing with housing and income while the nation is on stay-at-home orders, we wondered if jurors would hold the furloughs and layoffs that have occurred against corporations. Are CEOs and executives being greedy, or are layoffs necessary to stay in business? What about a company's good deeds helping the COVID response? Will there be goodwill going forward? First, we found that jurors believed many corporations were exhibiting business pragmatism to keep the doors open after the COVID situation is over, even if that means laying off workers right now. Second, while jurors were understanding about a company needing to lay off or furlough workers, they were less forgiving about corporate executives. The majority believed the layoffs were an example of corporate executives' greed and putting workers second. And third, jurors gave companies credit for helping to make products that would help the fight against COVID-19. But how do we explain the seemingly opposing views of layoffs being acceptable given these circumstances as compared to executive greed causing the layoffs? We examined several factors such as political leanings, social leanings, and fiscal leanings, among others. And here's some of what we found. To help us understand jurors' backgrounds, we asked them whether they consider themselves to be financially conservative or liberal. We often find dichotomous views within an individual juror who may be socially liberal but fiscally conservative, for example. In this case, across a much wider set of factors than we'll have time to present here today, the respondents' financial conservatism or liberalism was the strongest and most meaningful factor in their responses and is what allows us to see where the differences among individual jurors' attitudes lie. So back to the first point, in this chart, for example, we broke down the large number of jurors who agreed with corporate layoffs. When we look more closely at those respondents' financial views, the fiscal conservatives had the greatest agreement with the corporate layoffs, and the financial liberals were in the most disagreement. When it came to corporate greed, the fiscal conservatives and liberals had very divergent views. Financial liberals were the most in agreement that layoffs and furloughs were a sign of greed by corporate executives, while the moderates and conservatives disagreed. Some good news, however, is that while there were in fact statistically significant differences between the fiscal conservatives and liberals, the degree and trajectory of those differences were less stratifying than the prior comparisons when it came to corporations stepping up to help with COVID efforts. It appears that regardless of their fiscal views, most jurors wanted to give corporations who help the community at least somewhat of a break. Overall, jurors' opinions haven't changed dramatically, and if anything, became slightly more positive in 2020 than in the past. Because jurors were able to discern between companies, whether they had heard negative or positive information in the media, and it affected their opinions, this may be a good time to position any extra assistance toward the COVID-19 response to support a good company story that may be told in trial. Although jurors are giving corporations generally a little credit, at least for now, for furloughs and layoffs as necessary business practices, they aren't necessarily passing that goodwill to corporate executives and CEOs. This could end up affecting jurors' perceptions of corporate witnesses, so we'll need to keep an eye on that trend going forward. Next, Dr. Polovin will turn our attention toward the results of our government attitudes survey.
All right, now let's look at current attitudes toward the federal government and its agencies. In today's business landscape, in industries from manufacturing to banking, government agencies play an ever more important role in regulations of many things, such as products, warnings, workplace environments, and financial transactions. Defendants frequently must point to the controlling government agency and its regulations to show compliance, but often also to convince jurors that the government agency standards were safe and not merely bare minimum. For example, in talc cases and pharmaceutical cases, a common defense is meeting FDA standards or FDA approval. In an asbestos exposure case, a manufacturer's compliance with OSHA standards is important in showing the company's safety culture and adherence to regulations. In environmental cases, jurors hear about whether EPA standards were stringent enough to keep people safe from toxins. And in cancer cases, jurors hear about the CDC and carcinogen classification. The list continues, as do jurors' doubts about whether the government is really doing enough. Clients often ask us whether jurors really trust those government agencies, and thus, if a company can convince jurors that government regulations are based in science and keep people not only safe, but very safe. If jurors don't trust the government and its regulations, how can they trust a company who relies on government standards to keep people safe? Is that really safe enough? Well, we administered a survey on attitudes toward the government and government agencies just last month because we wanted to capture shifting attitudes due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the government's response to it. We compare this to data to a similar survey we ran in 2013 to see how government attitudes have shifted, as well as to examine where these attitudes currently stand in the midst of the pandemic. Starting with opinions about the federal government overall, we see that it was pretty negative in 2013. But now it's even worse. This is pretty typical for people to have a negative view of the federal government. But what is of interest is the shift. The opinion of the federal government is much more negative than it was in 2013. Positive evaluations of the federal government went from 16% to 18%, while negative evaluations went from 56% up to 67%. And regarding the federal government and safety standards, in 2013, there was a moderate amount of trust, with 43% agreeing that they trust when the federal government says something is safe, whereas 36% disagreed. But that also has shifted in the past 7 years. The same amount of people disagreed with this statement, 36%. However, there was a significant shift in the amount of people who agreed. It went from 43% all the way down to 19%, showing that people have much less trust in federal safety standards. Looking at other data about federal safety standards and regulations, we see similar results. This is data about the percent of people who think the government does a good job protecting the public from harmful substances, and the belief that government regulations are manipulated by large corporations very often or always. Now, there is substantially less trust in the federal government protecting the public from harmful substances, which we see with this shift from 40% saying the government does a good job in 2013 to 26% in 2020. There is also a more cynical view of the independence of the federal government agencies, as in 2013, 40% believed that government regulations were manipulated by large corporations very often or always. But in 2020, this number jumped to 73.6%. Now, let's look at some individual government agencies and how attitudes toward them have shifted. Our data from 2013 included evaluations of the EPA, FDA, and OSHA. Much like the shift that we saw in attitudes toward the federal government, we see similar shifts in the opinions of the EPA and the FDA. For the EPA, when asked if subjects trust the EPA when it says something is safe, in 2013, 58% agreed. But in 2020, this dropped to 34%. For the FDA, similarly, when we asked subjects to evaluate the job the FDA is doing, ensuring medications it approves are safe, in 2013, 69% thought the FDA was doing a good or excellent job. But in 2020, Only 25% think the FDA is doing a good or excellent job. OSHA, on the other hand, has had a positive shift in attitude. In 2013, subjects rated how well the agency keeps workers safe, and 64% rated OSHA as average, good, or excellent. This number increased to 84% in 2020. So overall, we have seen some negative shifts over the past 7 years, as there is a more negative view of the federal government, an increased belief that corporations manipulate regulations, and more distrust in the EPA and FDA. There is, however, more trust in OSHA keeping workers safe. Now let's focus on just 2020 and where people's attitudes and opinions of the government and federal agencies are currently at. We already saw that opinions of the federal government are worse than they were in 2013. However, here's some data on recent changes. People report that they have a more negative opinion of the federal government just this year. So this negative shift that we saw from 2013 to 2020 wasn't just because of a change in leadership, but it is something that has had a significant shift in just the last few months alone. So does that mean going forward that defendants who rely on federal safety standards are in trouble? Well, not necessarily. Although current feelings about the federal government as a whole aren't good, opinions on the individual agencies differ. When asked about how positive or negative opinions of the government and these agencies are, we see the average of the federal government pretty low, but the agencies are all above the midpoint. The views of the CDC, EPA, FDA, and OSHA were all significantly more positive than the federal government. Here you can see that the CDC has a very positive reputation currently. Given their importance in this pandemic, it's not surprising. OSHA also has a very positive opinion, but this is something that's normal. Jurors have always seemed to have a more positive view of OSHA than either the EPA or FDA. In comparison to their overall opinion, people seem to have more trust in safety standards. But the comparison between the agencies and the federal government is still similar. People have a very positive view of the CDC and OSHA, with the FDA and then the EPA having slightly lower levels of trust. Again, all of the agencies are significantly more positive than the federal government. We see similar results in thoughts on how the government and the federal agencies are protecting Americans from COVID-19. People have higher opinions of the agencies than the federal government. So although attitudes toward the federal government are pretty negative right now, the same doesn't hold for the government agencies. Jurors are able to discern between the agencies and the federal government. They have more positive views of the individual agencies, which is a good thing for companies that rely on safety standards of a government agency. There are similar feelings about how the government and the agencies are handling COVID-19. This will likely stick in the minds of jurors as long as this outbreak lasts, and likely for some time after. But again, this isn't all bad for companies that rely on a government agency's safety standards because their views are more positive. So does this apply for everyone? Well, when we examined whether these differences were universal or not, we found that they didn't apply to everyone. One of the strongest determining factors in how people viewed the agencies in comparison to the federal government was their political stance. So when we included political stance in the model, we found what is called an interaction effect. That is, the difference between views on the federal government and views on the government agencies is significantly stronger for some than for others. For Democrats, these differences are huge. For Republicans, these differences are minimal or non-existent. We see similar results in how people of different political stances are evaluating the job the federal government and the government agencies are doing protecting Americans from COVID-19. Here, Democrats still have a significantly worse view of the federal government than the government agencies, but Republicans actually have a significantly more positive view of the federal government than the government agencies. So what does this mean when we consider how this influences jurors and their thoughts in trial? Well, it will be important to think about how to frame the message when the defense is relying on government standards. In more liberal jurisdictions, knowing that jurors' attitudes toward government agencies are likely more positive than their attitude toward the federal government, don't just say your client met government safety standards. Instead, saying that they met EPA standards or followed CDC guidelines, for example, should help with convincing jurors that your client acted reasonably. Now, these effects were much smaller or even non-existent for Republicans, particularly for people who called themselves socially conservative. In fact, their view of the EPA was significantly more negative than the federal government. So consider the political leaning of the jurisdiction and how to best frame your message. What's also interesting is that despite the negative views and lack of trust in the federal government and mixed reviews of the agencies, people think it's very important for companies to be in compliance with their safety standards. Nearly 80% agreed or strongly agreed that it is critically important for companies to be in compliance with all safety standards set by government agencies. So why is it that despite a lack of strong support and trust for the federal government and its agencies, there is overwhelming support that companies need to be in compliance with their safety standards? Well, unfortunately for defendants, it's because many view these standards as the bare minimum. Over 70% agree or strongly agree that meeting safety standards set by government agencies is just the bare minimum. Companies need to increase their safety standards to adequately protect people. What our analyses revealed is that the imperfect views of agencies carry over to beliefs that their standards or policies are also imperfect. This means that for companies that have relied on government standards, it will also be important in trial to give support for why those standards are in place, and will likely have to convince jurors that those standards are reasonable. And certainly, if your client surpassed government standards, emphasize that. And we've heard this over and over from jurors. An example from one mock juror: did they meet the standards? Yes, but they could have done more. An example from another mock juror that we've heard: companies need to go above and beyond government standards to keep their employees safe. So why is it that people have these imperfect views of government agencies? Well, our data showed that they tend to think that regulations are influenced by corporations, by politics, and that the agencies are underfunded. Over 80% agree or strongly agree that government agencies are oftentimes manipulated by large corporations. In fact, when asked about how often this occurs, only 4% believe that government regulations are rarely or never manipulated by large corporations. For example, one mock juror with particularly strong views said, the FDA is a revolving door. Corporate execs go to the FDA, dismantle regulations for their company, and then go back to make millions of dollars. And nearly 90% agree or strongly agree that government agencies are oftentimes manipulated or often influenced by politics rather than science. When respondents were asked about whether each of the 4 agencies discussed here are underfunded, across the 4, only 20 to 30% disagreed that they lacked the resources they need to do their jobs. The correlations between safety standards as the bare minimum and agencies being underfunded were all around 0.5, which is considered a very strong effect. So what we found is people have a negative opinion of the federal government, but they're able to discern between the government and its agencies. And we see that people have a more positive opinion about government agencies than the federal government. So for company defendants that follow government safety standards, it's important to talk about this in relation to the specific government agency. Say that your client followed EPA protocol or met FDA standards. This is particularly important for liberal jurisdictions. However, for very socially conservative jurisdictions, this distinction isn't always necessary. And lastly, despite the more positive views of government agencies, those views are also not perfect. In fact, some of them are quite mixed. People think that they are underfunded and influenced by corporations and politics. So meeting government standards isn't always an effective argument alone. It is still important to teach jurors where those standards came from and why they're in place, and that they are safe. So now you'll hear from Dr. Katrina Cook, who is going to talk about current attitudes toward the pharmaceutical and medical device industry.
Thanks, Dr. Polovin. Hello, everyone. The next topic our surveys touched upon was their views on the pharmaceutical and medical device industry. Given the current situation with COVID-19, the pharmaceutical industry is even more in the news than usual. The race for treatments and a vaccination for COVID-19 puts increased pressure on the pharmaceutical industry and presents more opportunities for individuals to form both positive and negative views of the actions of pharmaceutical and medical device. Additionally, with the rise of the anti-vaccination movement, the pharmaceutical industry has become an increasing target for conspiracy theories. As you can see from the following social media posts, the current situation with COVID-19 also has the potential to spawn and spread conspiracy theories regarding the actions of pharmaceutical companies. This first post says, "I'm not a conspiracy theory guy, but I'd heard this from another source with some cred. Big Pharma with vaccine would definitely profit." And they've linked an article that says, "Nobel Prize winning scientist who discovered HIV says coronavirus was created in a lab." This next post says, "Pharma pushes a $1,000 pill, yet a 75-year-old solution seems to be working great. It also costs a few bucks, like Starbucks, few bucks. Get some HCQ, zinc, Azthero, whatever it's called, and bingo, pandemic will be gone." And finally, CDC has patents for over 20 vaccines in partnership with Big Pharma. This is a conflict of interest and why I don't get vaccines. How can I trust the recommendation of the CDC to get a vaccine that they profit from? This is the reason healthcare should not be for profit. Interestingly enough, however, during the social media coding Dr. Leibel was talking about earlier, we saw almost no posts from those jurors referencing Big Pharma conspiracies. So while the potential for conspiracy theories is clearly there, it appears not to have taken hold strongly or widely as of yet. From our previous research in pharmaceutical cases, we discovered several key issues faced in litigation involving pharmaceutical and medical device companies. First, jurors feel as though pharmaceutical companies frequently place profits over the safety of their customers. This negative view of pharmaceutical companies can potentially make jurors more likely to believe these companies committed negative acts. Second, jurors dislike feeling as though they have been denied a choice about their medical care. Time and time again, we see jurors saying, "The plaintiff was denied a choice about whether to use the product. If the plaintiff had known, they would never have used it." This is one reason jurors are so focused on wanting transparency from the medical community, or from the pharmaceutical community. They want to feel as though they can make an informed choice. Finally, government regulations are usually a bare minimum for jurors, as mentioned by Dr. Polovin. While some jurors are fine with companies meeting government standards, many want companies to go above and beyond these standards, saying it's what a good company would do. So those were our previous lessons learned from pharmaceutical cases. Let's see what jurors are saying about the pharmaceutical and medical device industry now. And several of these slides say pharmaceutical companies. We showed similar results for medical device companies. Here you can see when we asked people their opinions about pharmaceutical companies, 34% had a negative opinion, 55% had a neutral opinion, and 11% had a positive opinion. The relatively high percentage with a negative opinion tracks with previous data. However, it is encouraging that on this survey at least, there was also a high percentage of people with a neutral opinion. Next, as we discussed previously, many jurors believe pharmaceutical companies value profits over patient care. And we can see that here in the results of our survey. 63% of individuals agree most pharmaceutical companies place profits over patient care, while only 14% disagree. Further, jurors want pharmaceutical companies to care about the public. When we asked whether companies should be giving medical supplies away for free during this time, 53% of respondents said yes. So while jurors believe pharmaceutical companies value profits over safety, their expectations for pharmaceutical companies still remain high. And as we saw during Dr. Leibel's presentation, jurors do give companies credit when they perform positive acts. So if jurors don't trust pharmaceutical companies to place consumer well-being over profits, do they trust them to tell the truth? As you can see from the graph, pre-COVID-19, 54% of jurors agreed that people should be skeptical of what drug companies tell them about the medications they take. However, on our current survey, only 37% agreed with this. However, when we ask more generally about whether they can trust what pharmaceutical companies tell them, 41% disagreed that people can trust what pharmaceutical companies tell them. As we talked about previously, jurors want to feel as though they have been given an informed choice about their medications. As such, we asked jurors whether the pharmaceutical industry adequately informs the medical community about any risks associated with their products. Pre-COVID-19, you can see that 43% agreed, while only 8% disagreed. Post-COVID-19, 50% agreed, but the percentage who disagreed has risen to 26%. So it looks like more jurors are distrusting the pharmaceutical industry to be transparent regarding the side effects and risks of their products. We also asked jurors whether pharmaceutical companies should tell the public about any potential risks associated with their products. And as you can see here, a strong majority agreed that they should disclose any possibility, no matter how small, that there are risks associated with their products. Consumers want to believe that they are being given a choice and know all the facts. Next, we wanted to see what jurors' attitudes were towards the FDA in order to see how much trust they placed in the entities that create government regulations. This is particularly important because in cases involving cosmetics, pharmaceutical companies, and medical device companies, the FDA sets the standards these companies are expected to abide by. As Dr. Polovin spoke about previously, current trust in the FDA is low. So we also wanted to see whether jurors believe it was properly regulating the pharmaceutical industry. Prior to COVID-19, 29% of jurors believed the regulation of prescription drugs by the FDA was too lenient. Post-COVID-19, 36% of jurors felt the same. So for many jurors, the FDA is not doing a good job of making sure prescription drugs are safe, and that number who believe that is increasing. This may be tied to decreased confidence in the FDA. When asked whether their confidence in the FDA has increased, decreased, or stayed the same, 60% said that it had decreased, confirming the previous results that Dr. Polovin mentioned. This ties back into jurors believing government standards are the bare minimum that companies need to reach. With this increasing lack of confidence in the FDA, jurors may be even more inclined to expect companies to go beyond these standards. Finally, for the pharmaceutical survey, we wanted to see what jurors' attitudes were towards pharmaceutical companies and lawsuits. So we asked jurors whether lawsuits were a good way to make sure pharmaceutical companies meet their social responsibilities. From our previous surveys, pre-COVID-19, only 32% of jurors agreed with this statement. However, post-COVID-19, 42% of jurors agreed. We can also see that the percentage of jurors who disagreed has gone from 40% to 23%. So it looks like more jurors believe lawsuits are a good remedy for perceived misdeeds by pharmaceutical companies. On our current survey, we also asked whether jurors believe the American legal system is rigged in favor of big pharmaceutical companies. As you can see here, 60% of jurors believe that it is. So not only do jurors believe the pharmaceutical industry places profits over the safety of their consumers, and that lawsuits are a good way to combat this, they also have little faith that the legal system is going to be fair. This could potentially lead jurors to want to send a message to pharmaceutical and medical device companies when rendering verdicts in order to level the playing field. So going back to our previous lessons learned, do these still hold up? Yes, profits over safety still holds up. Jurors still tend to believe pharmaceutical companies place profits over the safety of their customers. Number two, jurors still want to feel as though they are transparent about the risks associated with their products and also are somewhat skeptical about the honesty of pharmaceutical and medical device companies, although in some cases less so than previously. And yes, jurors still do believe that government regulations are the bare minimum, and increasing distrust of the FDA is more likely to make jurors inclined to believe companies should go beyond the standards set by this and other agencies. Finally, given the current public debate about masks, we wanted to see if jurors' attitudes towards respirators had shifted. Our mask and respirator survey was actually the first into the field on March 15th. The data collection was during the time when the CDC was not recommending mask wearing for the general public. But we were particularly interested in understanding the baseline of mask and respirator use in a broad national survey compared side by side to our real trial juror data in heavy use areas such as coal mining regions, and areas where we have had substantial respirator cases such as Mississippi and California. Before I launch into the data, a caveat to the pre-COVID data should be mentioned. We entered the data from mock trial and real trial questionnaire responses from past jurors, which had very slight differences in wording compared to our current national COVID study from March. So the past trial jurors' responses could have been more inclusive of mask use than our very specific COVID-19 questions. But we thought it was important to assess jurors' views of the current state of face coverings. Before 2020, with real trial jurors and a small sample of mock jurors, they reported a lower usage of non-respirator masks than our survey sample by about a 15% difference. So as you can see here from the graph, lower uses of masks. More important to our analysis was whether respondents believed the masks they use were protective. This is often a voir dire issue that can lead to cause challenges when jurors used a mask and did not believe they were protected. You'll see in the past, jurors were asked a yes/no question as to whether the mask protected them. In that case, 84% felt that it did, which is a positive result. In the March survey, we wanted to understand jurors' views in a more nuanced perspective. So we asked how well they felt it protected them. Only 10% believed it protected very well. 48% thought it protected well, but 40% thought it protected them only a little. This more detailed view of their lack of trust in masks can help us better frame the way we refer to respiratory protection products going forward, as well as for how experts and corporate representatives describe them. If it's a respirator, be clear, this is not a fabric or medical mask. Now we move into respirators. This was an interesting question because the media attention about an N95 mask shortage. The numbers of respirator users before 2020 and now remains fairly low. 34% of trial or mock trial jurors use one at home, 23% used one at work, but in the 2020 national sample, only 19% had used one at home or at work. While the percentage here is lower, statistically, the difference isn't really a meaningful one, especially given the previous caveat we mentioned regarding the differences in question wording. Again, what was more interesting was whether they believed the respirator protected them from harmful toxins. In the past, 85% believed that it did protect them. Now, 89% believed it protected them very well or well. It appears there remains some trust in respirators, and perhaps that even has even increased with media reports on the importance of N95 masks. Finally, a couple of results from the March survey proved interesting for review going forward. Even though only 19% of respondents believed disposable respirators were very effective in protecting people from toxins, another 69% found them somewhat effective. What is important about this is that many workplaces that engage respirator masks also employ a tiered air quality safety system, in which a respirator mask is at the end of the list. Next, we asked respondents about their current trust level in disposable respirators since January of 2020. Although the majority had not changed their views, it was interesting to see that 13% increased their trust and 8% decreased their trust. This tells us that asking about trust levels in jury questionnaires or voir dire may help ascertain a small and strikeable minority in respirator cases.
Thank you so much, Katrina. All right, we have a few questions here and a few more minutes at the end of our day, so I'd like to read a few. One of the first that came in are COVID attitudes sorting into previously established distinctions among jurors, or is it crossing lines and making a new layer? And I would say that goes to maybe the social media segment here. And, you know, I think that a lot of the posts are sorting into what we already knew in terms of the emotionality of some of the posts, the anxiety or fearfulness that we're seeing in the posts, the drama, jurors posting that they feel that they're not in control of their fate, that they're at the mercy of fate. Things like that, I don't see changing. But I do think that there is this new layer, because there are those 15% of our jurors that we're seeing who are just prolific posters. And that does mean something. And I think it means something in terms of potentially how willing they are to interact with the other jurors, and whether this has launched them into some sort of a community, either leadership position and or caring about the community more than they perhaps had before, coming together, for example. And I do see that as a potential factor that we should start looking for, that we didn't have in the past. Another question is, this is a really interesting one. Jurors who show up at first jury calls will be pretty confident individuals, probably those that are confident in their own precautions. Do you believe that lends to them being more plaintiff or defense oriented, if at all? I think the jurors who walk confidently right now through the world are ones who perhaps are less fearful, who feel more in control of their health and their fate. People who, on the other end of the spectrum, perhaps may be foregoing those protections that you mentioned. They could be the no mask contingent, and more willing, therefore, to be in public or in near others within that protected 6 feet. So I do think that the early arrivers to our jury pools will be potentially more conservative and or have more of a internal locus of control. We break that into, you can have an external or internal locus of control. For example, people with an external locus of control believe that the world acts on them. And those are the more fearful people, the victims. People who believe that they are in control of their own fate tend to be better defense jurors. And I suspect that we'll see a few more of those in the early stages than the fearful ones. All right, we also have a late-breaking question here. Now this one goes to Dr. Cook. You mentioned the respirator data was collected before the CDC had recommended that people wear masks. Do you think that the data has shifted since they made that recommendation?
That's a really interesting question, and definitely something we thought about when we were analyzing the data. Obviously, this is a moving situation where the constraints are changing as we move forward. And we've seen a swing where people have been started to be asked to wear masks, but we're also seeing at the moment a shift in the opposite direction, where some people are being resistant towards wearing masks and not wanting to wear masks in public. So it is likely that the data will have shifted. We'll likely see that more people have worn masks, but the question of whether or not it protected them, I suspect will start to break down a little more along maybe conservative or liberal lines, or people who have internal versus external locuses of control. So yes, it is extremely likely that the data will shift as we move forward, just because this situation has such shifting boundaries.
Great, thank you. And Nick, since we're a couple minutes over, I'm going to end the session with a question for you. And
Okay.
that, if political stance influences what people think about government agencies, how does that influence the decisions they make in jury selection?
Well, so I had talked about it from a perspective of how to frame your message, but it's certainly something to consider when thinking about all the factors in jury selection, but it's only one. So I wouldn't, pick a juror who's likely to have a better view of the CDC just because that's the only thing about them. But you need to take that into consideration with everything about them and the other factors that could influence juror distinguishers. So really that was meant for framing, but you can consider it with everything else that you can ascertain about that juror. Thank you for attending today, and thank you to Jill and Katie for your analyses and presentations on this. Thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to talking to you in the near future.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.